Well, today we have a special discussion for you in store. It is with Auron Macintyre, the author of the new book, The Total State: How Liberal Democracies Become Tyrannies. I'm David Gornoski, your host. And how are you, Auron?
Doing well, man. Thanks for
That's
having me.
great. So you've been out promoting the book. What is the biggest reaction theme you've received so far from the publishing of this book?
I think the funniest response that I've gotten consistently is people saying, "Hey, this describes what's going on, and I really don't like that it's correct." That's
Yeah, yeah,
the funniest response I've gotten. Thank you for writing this, but also I don't like it.
yeah. Don't kill the messenger, right? That's the
Right,
problem.
basically. Yeah, that's the hope.
Right. So you wrote this book and you've had a quick journey. I mean, what was it, 2020? You said you were still a kind of Sean Hannity type listener, right? I mean, we don't want to make fun of Hannity, but
Yeah, I wouldn't say was quite Sean Hannity tier, but yeah, I was a very what you would think of as kind of the average Fox News conservative. That was very much where my understanding of politics was, and so yeah, it's the COVID really put me through a master class on how power really works, and that's a lot of what the book is about.
and you were a local journalist, right, at the time? Is that correct?
Yeah, it was weird. I kind of fell backwards into it. My buddy was a writer for the local paper, and they had their political guy get moved to like Politico or something. It got like a national posting, and so they needed someone to cover it. So my buddy, who's a sports writer, had been stuck covering all of like the fire board meetings and the school board meetings and the city council, and he hated it. And so he asked me if I wanted to try my hand at freelancing some of their pieces so he didn't have to cover all that. And that's how I ended up becoming a local journalist.
And then why do you think that your message has had, I mean, because you're, and we get into it, you've been on the program a few times, so some of my audience may be familiar, some may not, but you've kind of taken a big, at, uh, I guess you would call it an axe to the tree of modern, mainstream conservatism and its kind of liberal foundations. Why do you think that message has taken on such a quick reception to the point now that you're at the blaze? I mean, that's pretty big.
I think the main thing is just that a lot of conservatives knew something was wrong, and I was one of them. Again, like I feel this. These are my people. I'm not some revolutionary. I don't have the edgy mindset. I'm somebody who just wants to grill. I want to just have the white picket fence. I'm very much in the core demographic of who conservatism is aimed at. So I totally understood kind of where everybody was coming from. But ultimately, a lot of people, myself included, felt like there was something that was wrong. There's something that was rotten at the core of this thing. And we just didn't know how to say it out loud. And so I think the reason that, there's been such a positive reception for me inside a lot of the conservative community is ultimately I am one of them. Like I'm not coming from the outside critiquing. I don't hate America. I don't hate the Constitution. I don't hate the founding fathers. I love all of this stuff. This is my culture. But ultimately, there are problems, there are issues, and those issues have been exploited by nefarious people who want to destroy our way of life. And so ultimately, I think a lot of people knew that while they still had the shared identity that was true and core to kind of the conservative cause, they needed a different way to view things because the way it's been described to them just wasn't working. And so I think that's why I've been able to kind of talk the way I have and been able to have the audience that I've had is mainly because a lot of people were already there and they just wanted somebody who could lay it out in a way that was understandable and still, was coming from someone who loved and cared about the country.
Now, you mentioned your love for grilling, which reminded me of that article that Curtis Yarvin wrote, of course, about the hobbits
Mm.
of the right and the elves of the elite, the beautiful elves that run society. And he said the hobbits don't really need to have power because they don't know what to do when they have it. Do you largely agree with that framing of things?
No, this is definitely where something that Curtis and I disagree with. Curtis, at his core, is part of the ruling class. He hates the ruling class. But he comes from those neighborhoods. He comes from that lineage. These are his people, and so he doesn't believe that anyone else could do the job. I don't think that's true. I do think he's right that much of Red America has lost what it means to govern themselves. And that's because they've lost the idea of having a competent, capable, and virtuous ruling class that emerges from inside kind of their own polity. And so I think that's really the issue that Curtis is missing there. He thinks that we're just going to be ruled by the current style of managerial progressive elites forever, and he really just wants them to treat red America better, as where I think that actually what we need is a shift in the type of ruling class that we have, and that means that it has to come from places outside of the coastal progressive elites that we've been dealing with for so long.
So, having said that, I want to start off, and excuse me for my voice, but I wanted to start off because we're on the precipice of hearing what the jury deliberation is going to be for Trump in this first criminal trial. How did we get to this point? And after you answer that question, I'd like you to address something that I explore a lot on this program, which is the Christ-haunted nature of our society, and because you talk about power a lot, and I want to know, why do you think Trump gets more cultural power the more he's perceived to be unfairly persecuted? I mean, this is not something that you see a phenomenon like this in earlier periods of history. In the Roman Empire, if somebody was being prosecuted, that didn't rally people around them to the point where they said, my God, this is a victim martyr. He's a victim of a witch hunt by the Roman Empire. My God, we got to rally around him. I hated him before, but now I love him. What is that phenomenon that makes him have more cultural power the more he's persecuted? And then, first of all, how did we get to such an insane, surreal moment in our country?
Well, I think we got here because ultimately, while the right has different beliefs than the left, they had more or less been governed by people who had bought in to the ruling system. They were dependent on the institutions and the ideas and the cultural capital that the left had largely defined. And so we got a lot of Mitt Romneys and George Bushes and John McCain's, who were all called Satan in their day. Each and every one of them in turn was demonized by the left while they were running for president or were president. They were called warmongers and baby killers, and in some cases that was true. But ultimately, each one of these people was still a controlled opposition. They were still largely in charge, was kind of the neoconservative foreign policy, the war machine, the eternal wars, the open borders. They were all bought into these essential projects that the ruling class thought were core to the continuation of their way of life. Trump came in, and the thing about Trump is he's non-ideological and he's from outside of politics. Now, in a lot of ways, this is bad because Trump just doesn't really hold, I think, a lot of the values that people like to project onto him. He doesn't really believe, I think, deeply on issues like, say, abortion, the way that a lot of people want him to. But the good thing about this is his lack of ideology meant that he just listened to what people said they wanted and sent it back to them. Like, a salesman actually does. Oh, you want this thing? I can deliver this thing to you. And that meant he said a lot of things that he wasn't supposed to say, like maybe we should close the border and maybe we should stop bombing kids. Like maybe that's something we should probably stop doing every year to enrich a bunch of really evil people. And that's all stuff that drove the ruling class crazy. And so now you're in this scenario where everyone, even a large percentage of the Republican Party or what's left of it, hates Donald Trump and wants him gone. And I don't think Donald Trump is some incredible hero. I don't think that ultimately he's even worthy of the movement that he's inspired. But really, his most amazing quality is his willingness to stand out and say whatever he wants and have these people absolutely lose their mind as they project their visions of Adolf Hitler or whatever onto him and all the terrible things he's going to bring about. And this means that the left is willing to break the rule of law, break the norms, destroy everything of that granted us the illusion of living in a neutral society. They're willing to crash all of that to the ground to get Donald Trump. And I think that's ultimately how he ended up in this scenario.
So then my second question, of course, was, why does it give him more power the more he's persecuted? What do you think is the phenomenon that he's pulling from there?
Well, sure. I mean, part of this, of course, I think you're pointing to is again that the reenactment of kind of the persecuted Christ, and I guess there's definitely some truth to that. Though honestly, to point to the Roman Empire, I think we could see another phenomenon here, which is Caesar being backed in the corner. Julius Caesar is a guy who wanted to be part of the ruling class. I think ultimately wanted the kind of power he felt was his birthright, but was forced through a number of circumstances into being a populare and working against the Senate. And ultimately, they started stacking charges against the guy, and it was either you have to come in and win, or you will be executed. The state will hold you as a criminal. And I think in a lot of ways, we're seeing Trump enacting part of that archetype. But there's most certainly the fact that ultimately Americans perceive an underdog. They perceive, someone who's persecuted as someone who holds a certain amount of authority, someone who has a certain level of veneration due to them. They don't like seeing the powerful raining down on somebody, breaking the rules just to go after someone who clearly, while you can say many deep flaws about Trump, he's certainly not Christ, has not done the things that they've accused him of. And I think that's why ultimately he's building a lot of support, despite the fact that they thought that this would destroy him. They thought that this would keep him from getting the Republican nomination. They thought that this would lose him the support of his base. And not only has this solidified his power inside the base, but it's actually increased his poll numbers and his popularity, even outside of his normal voting avenues, because ultimately people recognize that what's happening to him is deeply unfair, that he is being used as a scapegoat. I think ultimately for the regime, all the things that they want to be able to do to the average person is instead being piled on to Donald Trump. I mean, ultimately, one of the most powerful things Donald Trump ever said is, "They're not after me; they're after you. I'm just in the way." And I think a lot of people, the average people, do see it that way, and I think they're correct about that.
Yeah, do you believe that history is going somewhere, or that it's rather static and cyclical in your view of power? Because you're getting at the very underbelly in this book about the nature of power, the nature of culture, the nature of change. So you're touching at the raw nerves of who we are, which means you kind of get into the world of anthropology a little bit indirectly, even if not directly. You're gonna touch on these fundamental questions of like, well, is history kind of a static repeat, or does it move somewhere? Is it going in a direction that is discernible for us?
I'm going to split the baby on this one, which is probably not the popular thing to do, but I do think it's true. I think that there is a quality to human nature, to the archetypes that have been built into human existence by the divine, that mean that we go through cycles, that we continually approach certain things but fall short. We continue to build towards things and come apart, that ultimately nothing is eternal outside of what God has built in the world. And so therefore all things man builds will go through a life cycle just as man does, that there is a morphology to human civilization and therefore a cyclical nature. But I do also believe that ultimately there are truths beyond human nature. There are truths beyond humanity, that ultimately God is in control and that he is working out a plan. And so therefore, while we are cycling through civilizational cycles and we are acting out archetypes in our humanity, God is moving us in a general direction. And so
Yeah.
I think we are moving a direction, but that still does not mean that there aren't repeating archetypes, repeating cycles that are inevitable throughout human history because of what we are in our fallen state.
And as I've said many times, I kind of agree with that. I think that history is moving somewhere. It is going up, but it's going up in a kind of curly Q spiral fashion. So
Right.
some of those downturn swings, may not be uniform either. I mean, you could be going up, you have a big downturn that kind of goes down, but when it comes back up, it's better than it was, maybe a couple hundred years later. Who knows how these things work out? I think it's kind of up to us how we work it out, so.
Yeah, there's absolutely a level of free will involved here. I'm probably more deterministic than a lot of people would like, but I certainly do not believe that therefore robs us of our agency in our individual decisions. As Oswald Spengler said, optimism is cowardice. The Roman who stands, at Pompeii as the volcano rushes towards him still has the duty of acting in that moment. And I think that while we may not always choose where we are in the cycle of history and that there are world historical forces beyond our control, that ultimately we still have a duty to act on our own. And that does have a very significant impact on the way that each cycle plays itself out.
Yeah. See, I see, when Jesus said, when I am lifted up on the cross, I will draw all men unto me, right? And I think history is moving towards that. And so if you see Christ as a metaphor, as a magnet, it's drawing society and culture, even in its cyclical patterns, it's still kind of drawing it towards somewhere. And I think that the errors of things that we concoct, which you rightly criticize, liberalism and enlightenment ideologies, are errors insofar as they are man's attempt to erroneously replicate the effect of the cross in a direction that denies the cross. So it's an error that's actually still going ostensibly in the right direction. This is where I think I differ. I've often made a joke to some of the new right people, and I don't think you're part of it, but I call them the Little Caesars because they're always waiting for a Little Caesar to come and save them. And I don't think you can go back in history, although I think there's intelligence behind the idea of examining the way power actually works. Ultimately, I don't think you can go back in history and say, well, we could go back to a type of monarchy or something. That certainly seemed better than what we have now. I think the only way through it, the only way to beat it is to go through it. And to what extent liberalism has failed, it's because it hasn't necessarily imitated the calling of the cross truly, but has done so in a way which deviates from its truth of who we are as people and how we relate to one another.
Yeah, there's a lot there that I think is critical. First, I would say this. I don't think that any form of government is closer to God. And I say this because, for instance, Christian thinkers like Joseph de Maistre, I think correctly address this idea that ultimately the forms of government that are best for any given people are what is written down into their heart by the divine, that God writes on to the hearts of many different people the constitutions that they should bear, and that all constitutions are ultimately a reflection of the divine nature handed down to those people. So I don't know that, democracy or monarchy is particularly better in an objective sense. I think they are better suited to rule particular peoples, and in that way, they are closer to the divine when they are following the plan that I think God had for individual nations. And I think it's important to understand ourselves as nations and not as necessarily one unified political structure, because I think ultimately globalism is a mistake. It is an error to understand God's order. And so I think that's critical. But I do agree with you absolutely that in many ways, liberalism is the attempt to remove Christ from Christianity. It's the attempt to replace God with contract law and systems, to ultimately use the deistic trick of understanding that we exist in a divinely constructed universe, but to make the God of that universe so impersonal and remote that ultimately we are ruled by the systems put in place and not by the divine itself. And so I do think that is a critical thing, because ultimately, as you say, we seem to be moving in the direction of something, even though, so for many people, they would look at the current moment and say, well, Christianity is at a low moment, right? Because ultimately so many people become secular, or they rejected Christ. And so this is a huge thing. In fact, many Christians are terrified at the fall of the liberal order because they see the liberal order as the last reflection of Christianity in our societies. But I think that's wrong. I think you're correct that ultimately liberalism is actually a bastardization of Christianity. It's a heresy in an attempt to remove God from the order he created. And the reason that many of these liberal societies have ultimately fallen away from God is that they started as experiments of extracting God from the nature of their communities, the nature of their social orders. And so at the end of this, in this kind of postmodern moment, I think ultimately the postmoderns have an evil ideology. But the one thing they're right about is that as we move through this moment of like being completely ruled by rationality, having our entire epistemology be defined by the scientific and the cold and the determined factors therein, as we move beyond that, it actually reopens us to the possibility, I think, of the divine. And perhaps, hopefully, this time, as we spiral up, as you say, in the cycle, we take with us the lessons of liberalism, that ultimately we cannot separate the divine from our social order. And that means that while we incorporate many of the lessons that we learned in the liberal project, we reunify our knowledge in a way that puts us closer to recognizing the importance of being, the importance of a life lived and recognized in its moment, and not one that is just coldly disassociated from, I think, the real. And I think that's ultimately something that's going to be very important as we come to the end of, I think, what is kind of the reign of liberal democracy.
Ironically, I think that Christianity has to reclaim its um, incarnational material part of itself to get our culture to hook up back with it in an honest way, which means, for example, I was, listening to some of your ideas about your book, the total state, and you're keen to observe that fundamentally we are still operating on a foundational worldview, which is dead matter, which then, scientism becomes the religion that is the arcane priestly caste that can interpret the objective truth of reality using that dead, lifeless kind of, if there is a spiritual force, it's so abstract and obtuse to not be able to really relate to. And this is kind of the reigning worldview. I call it pseudo-Gnosticism because it still requires this atomistic, materialistic worldview as its foundation, which Gnosticism wants to, it has various flavors, but typically wants to get rid of profane matter completely. But they have to require a kind of materialism to then jump off into this kind of what I call the pseudo-Gnostic virtual world of ideology, of the mind, that everything is about the mind. And unfortunately, the conservative religious folks have taken them up and oftentimes have promoted this very predicament that we're in, that the Enlightenment said, religion is of the private mind. Public square is the place of rationality, which is fundamentally built on profane random atoms floating around, colliding together. And the private affair of religion is just a kind of a small side category where, in fact, I think we need an anthropological Christianity, which is why I promote Rene Girard's work. Although it's extremely challenging, it seems like, for it to scale at a higher level, but it'll take some time. It should get there soon, where you start to put the imitational, embodied, incarnational, ethical behavior of Christianity at the forefront of how we engage Christianity in history so that we see all the effects of it in our society more clearly, instead of thinking it's this random ideology that we accept or reject, and then we're like in this space where we're coming up with all these random ideologies like monarchism or communism or liberalism, and that's just over here, and then Christianity and the other faiths are just in the fairy tale world over here. That's a total BS. That's liberalism still, or whatever you want to call it. That's not true. Christianity, like, for example, the trial. I mean, the idea of having 12 jurors of your peers judge you. 12 disciples, right? 13th person is you. You're standing in trial. Who's supposed to be your advocate there? The 13th person, which would be Jesus Christ in the pattern of the gospel. Christ is standing there on your behalf in some sense. So the courtroom, even in its corruption, is still thoroughly saturated and haunted in our Western tradition by the gospel. Your attorney is the defense. The paraclete means the defense attorney. Your prosecutor is the accuser. The accuser cannot just wave a magic wand and declare you guilty because we have a Christ-haunted society. It requires 12 members of a jury, just like 12 disciples, and it requires your right to a trial with somebody who ostensibly will be your advocate, your defender in the image of Christ, right? And the truth can be somehow ascertained. This is a very Christ-haunted quirk of history. That's not a given. It wasn't just a random given that we would have come up with this, in my opinion, if not for the event of the cross.
Well, and I think the obsession with removing, like you said, so many of the organic elements of Christianity, so much of the manifested being that has to be deeply invested in your society for it to function, has of course stripped us and laid us bare for ideological possession, as you point out. ultimately, the failure of conservatism was to misunderstand what the Constitution was. The Constitution was not just some, body of magical political, laws, not some political technology that suddenly binds the evil spirits of the past together. It is simply an instantiation of the way of being of a people who were deeply committed to their Christianity. And all it's doing is manifesting the norms, the traditions, the history, the heritage that already existed between these people, that had already bound them together and defined their lives and defined the type of government that they were investing in. And what we decided to do was go ahead and rationalize that as much as possible and go ahead and abstract that as much as possible so that it could rule a bunch of people that it was never meant to rule. And that was the whole point of kind of sadly the kind of George Bush conservatism, right? Just democracy everywhere. As long as we just go, sprinkle a constitution on top of, I don't know, the Afghanis or the Iraqis or whoever, suddenly they'll just become new George Washingtons, that they'll just become new Thomas Jeffersons. But that's not how it works. And the desire to go ahead and disembody this system so that it can be, formatted to fit any people anywhere or format those people anywhere has really left us completely open to ideological possession. I think in a very just directly spiritual way, a demonic possession. And I think we see this on a very regular basis, that our society embraces these horrific things and treats them as normal because we've stripped away our own foundational identities. A lot of ways, the right is terrified of identity. Ooh, the identity politics. And of course, they're right. Like the cheap, ugly, plastic identities that the left offers us are wholly artificial and evil. But that doesn't mean what we need is less identity. What we need is more identity. We need
Yeah.
an organic identity found in our communities, found in our religion, found in our way of being that allows us to resist these ideological demons that are moving and controlling much of our society.
Yeah. Uh, you talk about lions and foxes, right? As power,
Hmm.
lions being the more direct, authoritarian, dictator type model of power. And then you talk about foxes, right? Foxes are what? They're the ones that are more slick, clever.
Yeah, so Vilfredo Pareto had this idea of residues, and it was his sociological system where these were kind of things that persisted throughout every different culture, even though they were defined in different ways. And the type one residue was the fox, this the clever, manipulative, the person who's interested in combining and creating new things. And then the lion is more of what we think of as kind of the strong, conservative, patriotic, patriarchal. Is interested in preserving tradition and identity, and it is much more capable with the physical rather than with the mental. And so ultimately, what we've run into is the situation where most leadership classes should have a mixture of the two. A healthy circulation of elites allows for new lions and new foxes to enter in as our needs change. So if we have to go to war, we'll probably need more lions. If we're busy trying to figure out abstract economic systems, we might need more foxes. And a healthy elite will allow the constant circulation of the best and the brightest in each one of these categories in to go ahead and provide a good mix of leaders that's dynamic and changes what your society needs. But if a society is unhealthy, if the ruling class is so desperately grasping its own power, it starts to limit the type of people who can enter. And what we've had is rule by foxes, as we can see the manipulations of our current class. They don't look like the classic lion style totalitarianism we're used to, right? Gulags and machine guns and the barbed wire and the jackboot on your neck. But what we see is really a digital gulag, right? A tyranny that looks very different, but is still tyrannical. Instead of having a prison for your body, our tyranny has created a prison for your mind, where you're not able to live out organic patterns of life. Being normal is functionally illegal as you're covered in this manipulative propaganda where every one of your social interactions is geared to go ahead and enforce the ideology of the state, where you can't function as a human being. You can't use your bank account. You can't get a job. You can't speak. You can't find a romantic partner. You can't do all the things that are normal to humanity without giving some kind of assent to the ruling ideology. And so this is the consequence of being ruled almost entirely by foxes, is we're ruled by nudges rather than shoves. And that feels like it's not totalitarian because we know what totalitarian looks like. It looks like 1984 and all of the authoritarianism of Hitler or Stalin. But actually, what we have is still a totalitarian in its nature. It's simply one that is much softer power and therefore more resilient, which is why it's lasted much longer than the managerial totalitarian states of, say, Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia.
Does he suggest that the Fox form has always existed in history or in recent history or for the last 2,000 years? Or?
No, he suggests that all of these are actually foundational personalities. There's actually, I believe, 7 or 9 residues he discusses, but the 2 that I focus on are the ones that are most prominent in politics, which are the foxes and lions. And he says that the foxes have always existed. In fact, we can trace this back to Machiavelli, where actually Machiavelli encourages the ruler to have the spirit of both the fox and the lion. The best rulers are the ones that can go ahead and have both aspects. Think of Julius Caesar with his ability to be an incredible general, but also an incredible politician capable of creating new things and manipulating systems. So that this has always existed. But what we are seeing is, for the first time, foxes have the ability to build these wildly abstract structures that completely remove the need for lions. The foxes are great at manipulating these large managerial bureaucracies that have allowed for the immense scale of society we have right now. And so while foxes are nothing new, foxes being able to create this kind of totalitarian structure, this bureaucratic structure at scale across the globe, is something new. And that's due to the amount of technology that's now available to foxes that's never been there before.
Yeah, and I think that again, using that image of the Christ magnet of history or the Christ-hauntedness, whichever way you want to look at it, it's pushing things forward. And I think it's perhaps created an environment in the West where the only thing that can survive its effect of undermining power are foxes with ever more clever disguises of handicap features. So now foxes are not just foxes, but they're foxes with very thick glasses, wheeling around in a wheelchair, right? Oh my God, you wouldn't hit me. I'm a fox in a wheelchair with glasses, and I have a skin condition of leprosy. So I'm a mangy fox. And then they put on more features. I'm an obese fox, or I'm a, whatever. I'm a fox of color. Whatever it is that makes you a person who has extra features of oppression, right? It's kind of the name of it's the escalating, never-ending game of the power dynamics of the West, but it's increasingly failing. It's increasingly getting poor results. I mean, it used to be that poor Greta Thunberg could trick people for a long time. You could present a little girl that looks like something from Hansel and Gretel and say, how dare you? And people would say, my God, this is a real victim speaking against power. And then people now, that same technology has allowed people to peel behind the curtain and say, wait a second, these are criminal oligarch war merchants and bankers. I mean, these are the biggest polluters of the world behind this lady, this little girl. This is not a real phenomenon of a victim speaking against power. And so they have to run off to the next thing, always perpetually hiding behind victims like hermit crabs looking for a new shell to protect themselves. Isn't that what's going on with the foxes? And is it not an effect of the gospel?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that they're constantly looking to look less and less dangerous, right? They're trying to obfuscate as much of their power as possible. They try to spread it across systems as much as possible, make it as benign as possible. The evil has to be as banal as you can imagine. And so, yeah, you notice that all of you notice how billionaires used to have top hats and monocles, and they used to look, and now they just wear jeans and they look like they dress at Walmart. But
Frumpy
that's to look,
t-shirt, yeah.
yeah, it's to look less threatening, right? It's to make it clear that you don't need to worry about me. I'm just, yeah, sure, I'm over here pulling some strings. Maybe I'm rewiring the way that your body works through a vaccine. Maybe I'm trying to figure out how to manipulate all of your crops genetically. Maybe I'm, but ultimately I'm not that threatening. You don't have, I mean, look at me. I'm Bill Gates. I'm a big nerd, right? Like how threatening could I be? You're right that is absolutely a phenomenon. But what's really funny is now that they think that they've gotten rid of enough of the lions, you can kind of see them desire to like come back and look scary again, right? Like you can see them being like, well, maybe you can't do anything about it. So maybe I am a lion. Maybe I've been playing the very scary, not non-threatening fox this entire time, but maybe I am a lion. And I think that's actually super dangerous for them, because ultimately they aren't lions. They don't have the capacity for this. And if they try to go ahead and crack down
Yeah.
violently, if they try to go ahead and play the lion when they're really a fox, especially when they have in many ways trained themselves to be the even lamer and less dangerous foxes that you're talking about, I think that they will end up hurting themselves and others quite a bit, because
Yeah, like
they
that
do not
dark
have that.
Brandon stuff. That's stupid. Nobody
Right.
likes it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Well, yeah, that's the thing, right? Is like they just don't have the capacity for this. So when
Yeah.
they play at that, when they play at being dangerous in that way, something that is just beyond their capacity, it shows. We can feel how weak that is, even while they're pretending to be strong.
Because they're very, I'm telling you, they're very, and I think you agree, their very brand is built on Christian aesthetics. So the moment you try to deny it openly, you lose the whole plot. They have nothing left. They're only so, and this is why I guess what I'm just kind of throwing this out there to see if this resonates. I don't know what your conclusions for the total state are, but it just seems like the answer is all about returning to uh, Christianity, not in necessarily a metaphysical sense first, but rather returning to the reality of how Christianity is an effect. It's a perception of the world, and acknowledging the perception that we have received because of the cross will help the public understand the magic trick that's being played on them by these foxes with ever clever disguises of handicaps and disabilities. Do you see what I mean? Like, what else explains? It's almost like Christ, when he says, it's hard for thee to kick against the pricks, meaning, once you are an ox saddled to his chariot, he's got you, and you really can't escape no matter how much you kick and try to kick him off of you. You can't escape the trap that you've set for yourself, which is to use his power of as the aesthetic and the concern for victims that he has unleashed in history, but try to use it for your own cynical control and coercion. Ultimately is a doomed effort, because you have to continually double down on these ever more elaborate thin veneers of victim martyrdom in order to maintain the game. And it just can't hold up in light of a multimedia distribution society where you can see the skeletons underneath their whitewashed tombs. You can start to see, wait, you do kill the prophets. You're not a prophet. You kill the prophets. Look at what Assange does for the left. They are losing their power. Look at what happens in our American support for what's going on in Gaza. That's quickly undermining, for the first time, the left has rejected the official establishment newspaper perspective on an issue. And the only way they did so was because culture and media was able to distribute unauthorized videos and photos of the victims of our Fox, branded government. And so that just, it viscerally made them recoil. And of course they fit it into a neo-colonial narrative, but it doesn't matter. They're still viscerally rejecting, for the first time since Occupy Wall Street, what the TV tells them to think. That's a good thing, right?
Yeah, I think ultimately it's very difficult to maintain this victimhood narrative as you capture every lever of power, right? But ultimately people see the way you're wielding power, and they recognize that, being terrified into worshiping the next victimhood class is not enough, and you can feel the hollowness. This, again, the stripping out of Christ from the Christian ethos ultimately does leave you exactly here. And I think that's, that's kind of my suggestion as how to attack this enemy, is ultimately, like you said, I think that this is doomed to fail. I think this project is doomed to fail. But in order for us to pick up the pieces, to go ahead and have a society worth holding up after kind of this process has worked itself out and these people have burned themselves to the ground as they try to pursue the failed project that you're pointing to, I think the key is that we have to go ahead and rebind ourselves into the types of virtuous communities that were meant to be ruled by the Constitution in the first place. That ultimately, the founders were right when they said that the Constitution was made for a moral and religious people, and it can't rule any others. And that means re-embodying the vision and understanding of the Christian community in a very real way. We're not, saving people halfway across the world. We're not, holding giant services across the country. We're doing things for our community. We're knowing our neighbor. We're making sure the command to love our neighbor was not the command to walk right by our neighbor as they drown so that we can go save someone across the world. We have to save our neighbor first. And I think that is really ultimately what keeps us from being controlled by the total state. The total state thrives on the idea of the impersonal, the abstraction, taking what was an organic society and stretching it well beyond the space in which it was supposed to originally exist. And I think for us to fight that, we have to ultimately go ahead and re-embrace the organic, the grounded, the embodied idea of a Christian society. And I think that means first turning, to our neighbor, to our community, caring for them, being sufficient in them, so that when the wider system that I think ultimately is coming apart comes apart, we have societies, we have cultures, we have communities that can stand inside that more embodied organic way of being and continue that tradition beyond the falling, hollow, bastardized version that is now carried on by our current regime.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you do think that the constitutional system we have in some way can be saved in that way, even though you're a critic of a lot of it?
I should say this. I think that whatever we do next, as you say, we cannot go back. And that is as true to classical monarchy as it is to the constitutional order, right? We cannot go back. The only way out is indeed through. And what that will mean is, hopefully, I think for those of us who are true conservatives, not political conservatives, but conservatives in the sense that we wish to bind ourselves to the great chain of being that links us to our ancestors and carries us to the future in each one of our successive generations for ourselves and for our posterity. That means that we'll need to carry forward the parts of the constitutional order that were core to our way of being, that did genuinely reflect who we were as a people, the shared values we had, the shared religion we had, and that will be part of what comes next. But I don't think we will just resurrect the Constitution. I don't think we can just go back to the constitutional order as it was. I'm not sure what comes next. I think that, again, as I already said, Joseph de Maistre is right that each people has a specific type of government that is written on their hearts by God. And that does shift over time because the people shift over time. So will we return to a constitutional republic? Will we have something that is more centered around a classical, more monarchical, autocratic view? Will we have something that is very different? I don't know. But what I do know is that the first thing we have to do is reconnect to those traditions if we're to understand what form of government would be emergent from the people we are now, not the people we want to pretend to be, not the people who we sometimes LARP as from the 1790s, but who we are today. And I think that's critical.
Do you subscribe to Carl Schmitt's idea of the friend enemy distinction and how it applies here, or?
I always prefer to understand Carl Schmitt in a descriptive manner rather than a prescriptive manner, if only because he was also a Nazi. But Carl Schmitt, I think his analysis and the understanding of the friend enemy distinction is accurate. I think ultimately, one of the things we have to understand about human nature is its desire to have a shared identity, and that ultimately the friend enemy dynamic will play out whenever there is a element inside society that challenges fundamental identities and also has access to political power. And so whether or not I believe in it, whether I want that to be the case is not really the question for me, in the same way that whether I want people to fall down and die because gravity exists is rather irrelevant, because either way gravity exists. So we should probably figure out how to have stairs and planes and things.
The reason why I ask is, how does that fit in with the way in which Christ models for us the Good Samaritan, where you go after and you take care of someone who is your enemy? You risk your life for your enemy. And if that's true, and if that's, in my theory of history, that's what's actually moving history forward, how can one, say that that kind of friend enemy distinction is something that's operative in an absolute way? when Christ, as the king of history, is pulling us towards something in which you'll be willing to lay down your life to save someone who's in need, even if they're a sworn enemy of your tribe?
So I think there's it's important not to go ahead and mix our biblical injunctions there. So the Good Samaritan and the call to love your enemy are not the same thing. However, the call to love your enemy, and Schmidt actually addresses this in his work. He makes the distinction between the public enemy and the private enemy. And so if we believe, and this is something we should work out in our theology, if we believe that the call of Christ is to love the public enemy, is to love the person who would come in and rape and pillage and destroy our country, then is Christianity a suicide pact? Is the call to go ahead and love your enemy or turn the other cheek, is that an indication that every Christian must let themselves be raped and killed? And if that is the case, then I think we've probably misunderstood Christianity, if only because this is not how it was understood by any of the church fathers or any of the traditions of the church. If we understand it as a call to love the private enemy, which I believe it is, then yes, that makes perfect sense, because the private enemy is the one that, while we may have hatred against, or may hate us, why we may have personal animus towards, we are called to reject that. We are called to embrace them as a member of our society, as someone who Christ loves. And even though we are called to treat the stranger well, this is very different from being called to treat the person who's planning to destroy our family as, just the the object of love. I think we have to make that distinction when we're trying to understand that scripture. We don't want to make bad exegesis in the hopes of like universalizing these things to the point where they make just human life a suicide pact. I don't think that's what Christianity means.
Who do you think is the public enemy then?
Well, in the course, the public enemy in the Schmittian sense is the one that directly endangers the identity of the group, their well-being. So, for instance, if Hitler is marching into New York, then the Germans are the public enemy, because they are planning to annihilate our way of life. They're planning to kill and steal and take that which we hold dear, that which we are called by God to protect, our families and our neighbors. How can I love my neighbor while I watch the public enemy destroy them? What does that look like? Right? Is loving my actual neighbor mean letting my metaphorical neighbor come in and rape his wife and kill him and destroy his home? I don't think so. I don't think that's what Christ meant by that. And I think that distinction matters. I think we have to understand that Christianity wasn't declaring that all Christian nations should stop being nations and should instead just become, a automatic sacrifice to all other aggressive nations that want to kill and destroy them. If we understood it that way, I guess you can, but then I wonder how you parse any existence of Christians after, I don't know, 100 AD.
Yeah. Well, Auron, I really appreciate your time. The book, The Total State, is available now. And anything else you'd like to share?
No, always great talking to you. The book is out everywhere. I've got my show over at the Blaze, and it's on podcasts and YouTube and everything, or a Macintyre show. Really appreciate talking to you.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.